Memories, Dreams, Reflections by C.G. Jung. Chapter 9, Travels. 1. North Africa. At the beginning of 1920, a friend told me that he had a business trip to make to Tunis, and would I like to accompany him? I said yes immediately. We set out in March, going first to Algiers. Following the coast, we reached Tunis, and then from Sousse, where I left my friend to his business affairs. At last I was where I had longed to be, in a non-European country where no European language was spoken and no Christian conceptions prevailed, where a different race lived and a different historical tradition and a philosophy had set a stamp upon the face of the crowd. I had often wished to be able for once to see the European from outside, his image reflected back at him by an altogether foreign milieu. To be sure, there was my ignorance of the Arabic language, which I deeply regretted, but to make up for this, I was all the more attentive in observing the people and their behavior. Frequently I sat for hours in the Arab coffee-house listening to the conversations of which I understood not a word, but I studied the people's gestures and especially their expression of emotions. I observed the subtle change in their gestures when they spoke with a European, and thus learned to see to some extent with different eyes and to know the white man outside his own environment. What the Europeans regarded as Oriental calm and apathy seemed to me a mask. Behind it, I sensed a restlessness, a degree of agitation which I could not explain. Strangely, in setting foot upon Moorish soil, I found myself haunted by an impression which I myself could not understand. I kept thinking about the land. I kept thinking that the land smelled queer. It smelled of blood, as though the soil were soaked with blood. This strip of land, it occurred to me, had already borne the brunt of three civilizations, Carthaginian, Roman, and Christian. With the technological age, what the technological age will do with Islam remains to be seen. When I left Sousse, I traveled south to Sfax, and thence into the Sahara, the oasis city of Tozor. The city lies on a slight elevation on the margin of a plateau, at whose foot lukewarm, salty saline springs well up profusely and irrigate the oasis through 1,000 little canals. Towering date palms formed a green, shady roof overhead, under which peach, apricot, and fig trees flourished, and beneath these alfalfa of an unbelievable green. Several kingfishers, shining like jewels, flitted through the foliage. In the comparative coolness of this green shade strolled figures clad in white, among them a great number of affectionate couples holding one another's in close embrace, obviously homosexual friendships. I felt suddenly transported to the times of classical Greece, where this inclination formed the cement of a society of men, and of the polis based on that society. It was clear that men spoke to men and women to women here. Only a few of the latter were to be seen, nun-like, heavily veiled figures. I saw a few without veils. These, my dragoman explained, were prostitutes. On the main street the scene was dominated by men and children. My dragoman confirmed my impression of the prevalence of homosexuality, and of its being taken for granted, and promptly made me offers. The good fellow could have no notion of the thoughts which had struck me like a flash of lightning, suddenly eliminating my point of observation. I felt cast back many centuries to an infinitely more naive world of adolescents who were preparing, with the aid of slender knowledge of the Koran, to emerge from their original state of twilight consciousness in which they had existed from time immemorial, and to become aware of their own existence in self-defense against the forces threatening them from the north. While I was still caught up in this stream of a static, age-old existence, I suddenly thought of my pocket watch, the symbol of the Europeans' accelerated tempo. This, no doubt, was the dark cloud that hung threateningly over the heads of these unsuspecting souls. They suddenly seemed to me like game who did not see the hunter, but, vaguely uneasy, scent him, quote-unquote, him being the god of time, who will inevitably chop into the bits and pieces of days, hours, minutes, and seconds, that duration which is still the closest thing to eternity. From Tozor, I went onto the oasis of Nefta. I rode off with my dragoman early in the morning, shortly after sunrise. Our mounts were large, swift-footed mules, on which we made rapid progress. As we approached the oasis, a single rider, wholly swathed in white, came towards us. With proud bearing he rode by without offering us any greeting, mounted on a black mule whose harness was banded and studded with silver. He made an impressive, elegant figure. Here was a man. Here was a man who certainly possessed no pocket watch, let alone a wrist watch, for he was obviously and unself-consciously the person he had always been. He lacked the faint note of foolishness which clings to the European. The European is, to be sure, convinced that he is no longer what he was ages ago, but he does not know what he has since become. His watch tells him that since the quote-unquote Middle Ages, time and its synonym progress have crept up on him and irrevocably taken something from him. With lightened baggage he continues his journey, with steadily increasing velocity, towards nebulous goals. He compensates for the loss of gravity and the corresponding sentiment d'incomplétude by the illusion of his triumphs upon such as steamships, railroads, airplanes, and rockets, that rob him of his duration and transport him into another reality of speeds and explosive acceleration. The deeper we penetrated into the Sahara, the more time slowed down for me. It even threatened to move backwards. The shimmering heat waves rising up contributed a good deal to my dreamy state, and when we reached the first palms and dwellings of the oasis, it seemed to me that everything here was exactly as it should be, and the way it had always been. Early the next morning I was awakened by various unfamiliar noises outside my inn. There was a large open space which had been empty the night before, but which was now crowded with people, camels, mules, donkeys. The camels groaned and announced the manifold variations of tone, their chronic discontent, their chronic discontent, and the donkeys completed the cacophonous screams. The people ran about in a great state of excitement, shouting and gesticulating. They looked savage and rather alarming. My dragoman explained that a great festival was being celebrated that day. Several desert tribes had come in during the night to do 2 days of field work for the marabout. The marabout was the administrator of poor relief and owned many fields in the oasis. The people were to lay out a new field and irrigation canals to match. At the further end of the square, there suddenly rose a cloud of dust, a green flag unfolded, and drums rolled. At the head of a long procession of hundreds of wild-looking men carrying baskets and short, wide hose appeared, with a white-bearded, venerable old man. He radiated inimitable natural dignity, as though he were 100 years old. This was the marabout, astride a white mule. The men danced around him, beating small drums. The scene was one of wild excitement, horses shouting, dust and heat. With fanatic purposefulness, the procession swarmed by, out into the oasis as if going to battle. I followed this horde at a cautious distance, and my dragoman made no attempt to encourage me to approach closer until we reached a spot where the quote-unquote work was going on. Here, if possible, even greater excitement prevailed. People were beating drums and shouting wildly, and the sight of the work resembled a disturbed ant-hill, and everything was being done with the utmost haste. Carrying their baskets filled with heavy loads of earth, men danced along to the rhythm of the drums. Others hacked into the ground at a furious rate, digging ditches and erecting dams. Through this wild tumult the marabout rode along on his white mule, evidently issuing instructions with the dignified, mild, and weary gestures of advanced age. Wherever he came, the haste, shouting, and rhythm intensified, and forming the background against which the calm figure of the holy man stood out with extraordinary effectiveness. Towards evening, the crowd was visibly overcome by exhaustion. The men soon dropped down beside their camels. The men soon dropped down beside their camels into deep sleep. During the night, after the usual stupendous concert of the dogs, utter stillness prevailed, until the first rays of the rising sun, the invocation of the muezzin, which always deeply stirred me, summoned the people to their morning prayer. This scene taught me something. These people live from their affects, are moved, and have their being in emotions. Their consciousness takes care of their orientation in space and transmits impressions from outside, and it also is stirred by inner impulses and affects, but it is not given to reflection. The ego has almost no autonomy. The situation is not so different with the European, but we are, after all, somewhat more complicated. At any rate, the European possesses a certain measure of will and directed intention. What we lack is intensity in life, or intensity of life. Without wishing to fall under the spell of the primitive, I nevertheless had been psychologically infected. This manifold itself this manifested itself outward in an infectious enteritis, which cleared up after a few days, thanks to the local treatment of rice water and 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 calomel. Overcharged with ideas, I finally went back to Tunis. The night before we embarked from Marseille, I had a dream which I sense summed up the whole experience. This was just as it should be, for I had accustomed myself to living always on two planes simultaneously, one conscious while attempting to understand and could not, and the one unconscious which wanted to express something and could not formulate it any better than by a dream. I dreamt that I was in an Arab city and as it in such cities, there was a citadel, a kasbah. The city was situated in a broad plain and had a wall all around it. The shape of the wall was square, and there were four gates. The kasbah in the interior of the city was surrounded by a wide moat, which is not the way it really is in Arab countries. I stood before a wooden bridge leading over the water to a dark horseshoe-shaped portal, which was open. Eager to see the citadel from the inside also, I stepped out on the bridge. When I was about halfway across it, a handsome, dark Arab of aristocratic, almost royal bearing came towards me from the gate. I knew that this youth in the white burnous was the resident prince of the citadel. When he came up to me, he attacked me and tried to knock me down. We wrestled. In the struggle, we crashed against the railing. It gave way, and we both fell into the moat, where he tried to push my head underwater to drown me. No, I thought, this is going too far, and in my turn I pushed his head underwater. I did so, although I felt great admiration for him, but I did not want to let myself be killed. I had no intention of killing him. I only wanted to make him unconscious and incapable of fighting. Then the scene of the dream changed, and he was with me in a large vaulted octagonal room in the center of the citadel. The room was all white, very plain and beautiful. Along the light-colored marble walls stood low divans, and before me on the floor lay an open book with black letters written in magnificent calligraphy on milky white parchment. It was not Arabic script, rather it looked to me like Uygurian script of West Turkestan, which was familiar to me from the Manichaean fragments from Turfan. I did not know the contents, but nevertheless I had the feeling that this was quote-unquote my book, that I had written it. The young prince with whom I had just been wrestling sat to the right of me on the floor. I explained to him that now that I had overcome him, he must read the book. But he resisted. I placed my arm around his shoulder and forced him, with a sort of paternal kindness and patience, to read the book. I knew that this was absolutely essential, and at last he yielded. In this dream, the Arab youth was the double of the proud Arab who had ridden past us without a greeting. As an inhabitant of the Kasbah, he was a figuration of the self, or rather a messenger or emissary of the self. For the Kasbah from which he came was a perfect mandala, a citadel surrounded by a square wall with four gates. His attempt to kill me was an echo of the motif of Jacob's struggle with the angel. He was, to use the language of the Bible, like an angel of the Lord, a messenger of God who wished to kill men because he did not know them. Actually, the angel ought to have been his dwelling in me, but he knew only angelic truth and understood nothing about man. Therefore he first came forward as my enemy. However, I held my own against him. In the second part of the dream, I was the master of the citadel, and he sat at my feet and had to learn to understand my thoughts, or rather learn to know men. Obviously, my encounter with the Arab culture had struck me with overwhelming force. The emotional nature of this unreflective person who, of these unreflective people who are so much closer to life than we are, exerts a strong suggestive influence upon those historical layers in ourselves which we have just yet overcome and left behind, or which we think we have overcome. It is like the paradise of childhood from which we imagine we have emerged, but which, at the slightest provocation, imposes fresh defeats upon us. Indeed, our cult of progress is in danger of imposing on us even more childish dreams of the future, the harder it presses us to escape from the past. On the other hand, a characteristic of childhood is that, thanks to the naivete and unconsciousness, it sketches a more complete picture of the self, of the whole person in their pure individuality, than adulthood. Consequently, the sight of a child or a primitive will arouse certain longings in adult civilized persons, longings which relate to the unfulfilled desires and needs of those parts of the personality which have been blotted out of the total picture in favor of the adapted persona. In traveling to Africa to find a psychic observation post outside of the sphere of the European, I unconsciously wanted to find that part of my personality which had become invisible under the influence and pressure of being European. This part stands in unconscious opposition to myself, and indeed I attempt to suppress it. In keeping with its nature, it wishes to make me unconscious, force me underwater, so as to kill me, but my aim is, through insight, to make it more conscious, and so we can find common modus vivendi. The Arab's dusky complexion marks him as a shadow, but not the personal shadow, rather an ethnic one associated not with my persona, but with the totality of my personality, that is, with the self. As master of the Kasbah, he must be regarded as a kind of shadow of the self. The predominantly rationalistic European finds much that is human alien to him, and he prides himself on this without realizing that his rationality is won at the expense of his vitality, and that the primitive part of his personality is consequently condemned to a more or less underground existence. The dream reveals how my encounter with North Africa affected me. First of all, there was the danger that my European consciousness would be overwhelmed by the unexpectedly violent assault of the unconscious psyche. Consciously, I was not a bit aware of any such situation. On the contrary, I could not help feeling superior, because I was reminded at every step of my Europeanism. This was unavoidable. My being European gave me a certain perspective on these people, who were so differently constituted from myself, and utterly marked me off from them. But I was not prepared for the existence of unconscious forces within myself, which would take part of these strangers with such intensity, so that a violent conflict ensued. The dream expresses this conflict in the symbol of an attempted murder. I was not to recognize the real nature of this disturbance until some years later, when I stayed in tropical Africa. It had been, in fact, the first hint of quite going black under the skin, a spiritual peril which threatens the uprooted European in Africa to an extent not fully appreciated. Quote, "Where danger is, there is salvation also." Unquote. These words of Holderlin often come to my mind in such situations. The salvation lies in our ability to bring the unconscious urges to consciousness with the aid of warning dreams. These dreams show that there is something in us which does not merely submit passively to the influence of the unconscious, but, on the contrary, rushes eagerly to meet it, identifying itself with the shadow. Just as a childhood memory can suddenly take possession of consciousness with so lively an emotion that we feel wholly transported back to the original situation, so these seemingly alien and wholly different Arab surroundings awaken an archetypal memory of an only too well-known prehistoric past, which apparently we have entirely forgotten. We are remembering a potentiality of life which has been overgrown by civilization, but which in certain places is still existent. If we were to relive it naively, it would constitute a relapse into barbarianism. Therefore, we prefer to forget it. But should it appear to us again in the form of a conflict, then we should keep it in our consciousness and test the two possibilities against each other: the life we live and the one we have forgotten. For what has apparently been lost does not come to the fore again without sufficient reason. In the living psychic structure, nothing takes place in a merely mechanical fashion. Everything fits into the economy of the whole, relates to the whole. That is to say, it is all purposeful and has meaning, but because consciousness never has a view of the whole, it usually cannot understand this meaning. We must therefore content ourselves for the time being with noting the phenomenon and hoping that the future, on further investigation, will reveal the significance of this clash with the shadow of the self. In any case, I did not at the time have any glimmering of the nature of this archetypal experience, and knew still less about the historical parallels. Yet I did not then grasp the full meaning of the dream. It lingered in my memory, along with the liveliest wish to go to Africa again at the next opportunity. That wish was not fulfilled for another 5 years. Part 2, America, the Pueblo Indians. Extract from an unpublished MS. We always require an outside point to stand on in order to apply the lever of criticism. This is especially so in psychology, where by the nature of the material we are much more subjectively involved than in other science. How, for example, can we become conscious of national peculiarities if we have never had the opportunity to regard our own nation from outside? Regarding it from outside means regarding it from the standpoint of another nation. To do so, we must acquire sufficient knowledge of the foreign collective psyche, and in the course of this process of assimilation we encounter all those incompatibilities which constitute the national bias and the national peculiarity. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. I understand England only when I see where I, as a Swiss, do not fit in. I understand Europe, our greatest problem, only when I see where I, as a European, do not fit into this world. Through my acquaintance with many Americans and my trips to and in America, I have obtained an enormous amount of insight into the European character. It has always seemed to me that there can be nothing more useful for a European than some time or another to look out at Europe from the top of a skyscraper. When I contemplated for the first time the European spectacle from the Sahara, surrounded by a civilization which has more or less the same relationship to ours as Roman antiquity has to modern times, I became aware of how completely, even in America, I was still caught up and imprisoned in the cultural consciousness of the white man. The desire then grew in me to carry the historical comparison still further by descending to a still lower cultural level. On my trip to the United States, I went with a group of American friends to visit the Indians of New Mexico, a city building pueblos. City, however, is too strong a word. What they build are in reality only villages, but their crowded houses piled one on top of the other suggest the word city, as do their language and their whole manner. There, for the first time, I had the good fortune to talk with a non-European, that is, a non-white. He was the chief of the Taos Pueblos, an intelligent man between the ages of 40 and 50. His name was Biano, Mountain Lake. I was able to talk with him as I have rarely been able to talk with a European. To be sure, he was caught up in his world just as much as a European is in his, but what a world it was! In talk with a European, one is constantly running up on the sandbars of things long known but never understood. With this Indian, the vessel floated freely on deep alien sea. At the same time, one never knows which is more enjoyable, catching sight of new shores or discovering new approaches to age-old knowledge that has been almost forgotten. See, Biano said, how cruel the whites look. Their lips are thin, their noses sharp, their faces furrowed and distorted by folds. Their eyes have a staring expression. They are always seeking something. What are they seeking? The whites always want something. They are always uneasy and restless. We do not know what they want. We do not understand them. We think they are mad. I asked him why he thought the whites were all mad. They say they think with their heads, he replied. Why, of course. What do you think with? I asked him in surprise. We think here, he said, indicating his heart. I fell into a long meditation. For the first time in my life, so it seemed to me, someone had drawn for me a picture of the real white man. It was as though until now I had seen nothing but sentimental prettified color prints. This Indian had struck our vulnerable spot, unveiled a truth to which we are blind. I felt resisting within me a shapeless mist, something unknown and yet deeply familiar. And out of this mist, image upon image detached itself. First Roman legions smashing into the cities of Gaul, and the keenly incised features of Julius Caesar, Scipio Africanus in Pompeii, I saw the Roman eagle on the North Sea and on the banks of the White Nile, and then I saw St. Augustine transmitting the Christian creed to the Britons on the tips of the Roman lances, and Charlemagne's most glorious forced conversions of the heathen, and then the pilgrimages and the murdering bands of the crusading armies. With this secret stab I realized the hollowness of the old romanticism about the the Crusades. Then followed Columbus, Cortez, and other conquistadors, who with fire, sword, torture, and Christianity came down upon even these remote pueblos dreaming peacefully in the sun, their father. I saw, too, the peoples of the Pacific Islands decimated by fire, water, syphilis, and scarlet fever, carried in the clothes the missionaries forced on them. It was enough. What we, from our point of view, called colonization, missions to the heathens, spread of civilization, etc., has another face, the face of a bird of prey seeking with cruel intentness for distant quarry, a face worthy of a race of pirates and highwaymen. All the eagles and other predatory creatures that adorn our coats of arms seem to me apt psychological representatives of our true nature. Something else that Biano said to me struck in my mind. It seemed to me so intimately connected with the peculiar atmosphere of our interview that my account would be incomplete if I failed to mention it. Our conversation took place on the roof of the 5th story of the main building. At frequent intervals figures of other Indians could be seen on the roofs, wrapped in their woolen blankets, sunk in contemplation of the wandering sun that daily rose into a clear sky. Around us were grouped the low-built square buildings of air-dried brick, adobe, with the characteristic ladders that reached from the grounds to the roof or from roof to roof of the higher stories. In earlier dangerous times the entrances used to be through the roof. Before us the rolling plateau of Taos, about 7,000 feet above sea level, stretched to the horizon where several conical peaks, ancient volcanoes, rose to over 12,000 feet. Behind us a clear stream purled past the houses, and on its opposite bank stood a second pueblo of reddish adobe houses, built one atop the other towards the center of the settlement, thus strongly anticipating the perspective of an Indian metropolis with its skyscrapers in the center. Perhaps half an hour's journey upriver rose a mighty isolated mountain, the mountain, which has no name. The story goes that on days when the mountain is wrapped in clouds, the men vanish in that direction to perform mysterious rites. The Pueblo Indians are unusually close-mouthed. In matters of their religion, absolutely inaccessible. They make it a policy to keep their religion practices secret, and this secret is so strictly guarded that I abandoned as hopeless my attempt at direct questioning. Never before had I run into such an atmosphere of secrecy. The religions of civilized nations today are all accessible. Their sacraments have long ago ceased to be mysteries. Here, however, the air was filled with a secret known to all the communities, but to which whites could gain no access. This strange situation gave me an inkling of Eleusis, whose secret was known to one nation, yet never betrayed. I understood what Pausanias or Herodotus felt when he wrote, quote, "I am not permitted to name the name of that god." Unquote. This was not, I felt, mystification, but a vital mystery whose betrayal might bring down the downfall of the community as well as the individual. Preservation of the secret gives the Pueblo Indian pride and power to resist the dominant whites. It gives him cohesion and unity, and I felt sure that the Pueblos, as an individual community, will continue to exist as long as their mysteries are not desecrated. It was astonishing to me to see how the Indian's emotions change when he speaks of his religious ideals. In ordinary life, he shows a degree of self-control and dignity that borders on fraternalistic equanimity. But when he speaks of things that pertain to his mysteries, he is in the grip of a surprising emotion which he cannot conceal, a fact which greatly helped to satisfy my curiosity. As I have said, direct questioning led to nothing. When therefore I wanted to know about essential matters, I made tentative remarks and observed my interlocutor's expression for those affective moments which are so familiar to me. If I had hit on something essential, he remained silent or gave an expansive reply, but with all the signs of profound emotion. Frequently tears would fill his eyes. Their religious conceptions are not theories to them, which indeed would have to be a very curious theory to evoke tears from a man, but in fact as important and moving as their corresponding external realities. As I sat with Biano on the roof, the blazing sun rising higher and higher, he said, pointing to the sun, "Is not he who moves there our Father? How can anyone say differently? How can there be another God? Nothing can be without the sun." His excitement, which was already perceptible, mounted still higher. He struggled for words, and exclaimed at last, "What would a man do alone in the mountain? He cannot even build his fire without him." I asked him whether he did not think the sun might be a fiery ball shaped by an invisible god. My question did not even arouse astonishment, let alone anger. Obviously it touched nothing within him. He did not even think my question stupid. It merely left him cold. I had the feeling that I had come upon an insurmountable wall. His only reply was, "The sun is God. Everyone can see that." Although no one can help feeling the tremendous impress of the sun, it is a novel and deeply affecting experience for me to see these mature, dignified men in the grip of an overmastering emotion when they spoke of it. Another time I stood by the river and looked at the mountain which rose almost 6,000 feet from the plateau. I was just thinking about this when the roof of the American continent, about this I was just thinking that this was the roof of the American continent, and that people lived here in the face of the sun, like the Indians who stood wrapped in blankets on the highest roofs of the pueblo, mute and absorbed in the sight of the sun. Suddenly a deep voice, vibrant with suppressed emotion, spoke from behind me into my left ear. "Do you not think that all life comes from the mountains?" An elderly Indian had come up to me, inaudible in his moccasins, and had asked me this heaven knows how far-reaching question. A glance at the river poured down from the mountain showed me the outward image that had engendered this conclusion. Obviously all life came from the mountain. From where there is water, there is life. Nothing could be more obvious. In his question I felt a swelling emotion connected with the word mountain, and thought of the tale of secret rites celebrated on the mountains. I replied, "Everyone can see that you speak the truth." Unfortunately, the conversation was soon interrupted, and so I did not succeed in attaining my deeper insight into the symbolism of water and mountain. I observed that the Pueblo Indians, reluctant as they were to speak about anything concerning their religion, talked with great readiness and intensity about their relations with the Americans. "Why," Mountain Lake said, "do the Americans not let us alone? Why do they want to forbid our dances? Why do they make difficulties when we want to take our young people from school in order to lead them to the kiva, the site of their rituals, and instruct them in our religion? We do nothing to harm the Americans." After a prolonged silence, he continued, "The Americans want to stamp out our religion. Why can they not let us alone? What we do not only for ourselves, but for the Americans also. Yes, we do it for the whole world. Everyone benefits by it." I could observe from his excitement that he was alluding to some extremely important element in his religion. I therefore asked him, "You think, then, what you do in your religion benefits the whole world?" He replied with great animation, "Of course! If we did not do it, what would become of the world?" And with a significant gesture he pointed to the sun. I felt that we were approaching extremely delicate ground here, verging on the mysteries of the tribe. "After all," he said, "we are a people who live on the roof of the world. We are the sons of Father Sun, and with our religion we daily help our Father go across the sky. We do this not only for ourselves, but for the whole world. If we were to cease practicing our religion, in 10 years the sun would no longer rise. Then it would be night forever." I then realized that the dignity, the tranquil composure of the individual Indian was founded. It springs from his being a son of the sun, a S-O-N of the S-U-N. His life is cosmologically meaningful, for he helps the Father and Preserver of all life in his daily rise and descent. If we set against this our own self-justifications, the meaning of our own lives as it is formulated by our reason, we cannot help but see our poverty. Out of sheer envy, we are obliged to smile at the Indian's naivete and to plume ourselves on our cleverness, for otherwise we would discover how impoverished and down in the heels we are. Knowledge does not enrich us, it removes us more and more from the mythic world in which we were once at home by right of birth. If for a moment we put away all European rationalism and transport ourselves into the clear mountain air of that solitary plateau, which drops off on one side into the broad continental prairies and on the other side into the Pacific Ocean, if we also set aside our intimate knowledge of the world and exchange it for a horizon that seems immeasurable and an ignorance of what lies beyond it, we begin to achieve an inner comprehension of the Pueblo Indian's point of view. Quote, all life comes from the mountain, unquote, is immediately convincing to him, and he is equally certain that he lives upon the roof of an immeasurable world closest to God. He, above all others, has divinity's ear, and his ritual act will reach the distant sun soonest of all. The holiness of mountains, the revelation of Yahweh upon Sinai, the inspiration that Nietzsche had vouchsafed in the Engadine, all speak the same language. The idea, absurd to us, that a ritual act can magically affect the sun is, upon closer examination, no less irrational, but far more familiar to us than might be at first be assumed. Our Christian religion, like every other, incidentally is permeated by the idea that special acts or special kinds of action can influence God, for example, through certain rites or prayers, or by a morality pleasing to the divinity. The ritual acts of man are an answer and reaction to the action of God upon man, and perhaps they are not only that, but also intended to be activating, a form of magic coercion, that man feels capable of formulating valid replies to the overpowering influence of God, and that he can render back something which is essential even to God, induces pride, for it raises the human individual to the dignity of a metaphysical factor. God and us, even if it is only an unconscious sous-entendu. This equation no doubt underlies the enviable serenity of the Pueblo Indian. Such a man is, in the fullest sense of the word, in his proper place. 3. Kenya and Uganda. Tout est bien sortant des mains de l'auteur des choisis, des choses. Um, everything is goes well at the hands of the author of things, I think. It's Rousseau. When I visited the Wembley exhibition in London in 1925, I was deeply impressed by the excellent survey of the tribes under British rule and resolved to take a trip to tropical Africa in the near future. In the autumn of that year, I set out with two friends, an Englishman and an American, from Mombasa. We traveled on a Warman steamer, together with many young Englishmen going out to posts in various African colonies. It was evident from the atmosphere aboard ship that the passengers were not traveling for pleasure, but were entering upon their destiny. To be sure, there was a good deal of gay exuberance, but the serious undertone was also evident. As a matter of fact, I heard of the fate of several of my fellow voyagers even before my own return trip. Several met death in the tropics and in the course of the next 2 months. They died of tropical malaria, amoebic dysentery, and pneumonia. Among those who died was the young man who sat opposite me at a table. Another was Dr. Ackley, who had made a name for himself as the founder of the guerrilla reservation in Central Africa, and whom I had met in New York shortly before this voyage. Mombasa remains in my memory as a humidly hot European Indian and black settlement hidden in the forest of palms and mango trees. It is an extremely picturesque setting on a natural harbor with an old Portuguese fort towering over it. We stayed there for 2 days and left towards evening on the narrow gauge road for Nairobi in the interior, plunging almost immediately into the tropical night. Along the coastal strip we passed by numerous African villages where the people sat talking about around tiny fires. Soon the train began to climb. The settlement ceased and the night became inky black. Gradually it turned cooler and I fell asleep. When the first ray of sunlight announced the onset of day, I awoke. The train, swathed in a red cloud of dust, was just making a turn around a steep red cliff. On a jagged rock above us, a slim, brownish black figure stood motionless, leaning on a long spear, looking down at the train. Beside him towered a gigantic candelabrum cactus. I was enchanted by the sight. It was a picture of something utterly alien and outside my experience, but on the other hand, a most intense sentiment de déjà vu. I had the feeling that I had already experienced this moment and had always known this world, which was separated from me only by the distance and time. It was as if I were, this moment, returning to the land of my youth, and as if I knew the dark-skinned man who had been waiting for me 5,000 years. This feeling tone of this curious experience accompanied me throughout my whole journey through Africa. I can now recall only one other such recognition of the immemorially known. That was when I first observed a parapsychological phenomenon together with my former chief, Professor Eugene Bleuler. Beforehand, I had imagined that I would be dumbfounded if I were to see so fantastic a thing, but when it happened, I was not surprised at all. I felt it as if it was perfectly natural, something I could have taken for granted because I had long since been acquainted with it. I could not guess what string within myself was plucked at the sight of that solitary dark hunter. I only knew that his world had been mine for countless millennia. Somewhat bemused, I arrived around noon in Nairobi, situated at an altitude of 6,000 feet. There was a dazzling plethora of light that reminded me of the glare of sunlight in the Engadine as one comes out of the winter fogs of the lowlands. To my astonishment, the swarm of boys assembled at the railroad station wore the old-fashioned gray and white woolen ski caps, which I had once seen worn or worn myself in the Engadine. They were highly esteemed because the upturned rim can be let down like a visor in the Alps, good protection against the icy wind here, and again against the blazing heat. From Nairobi, we used a small Ford to visit the Athi Plains, a great game reserve, and from a low hill in this broad savanna a magnificent prospect opened out to us. To the very brink of the horizon we saw gigantic herds of animals, gazelles, antelope, gnu, zebra, warthog, and so on, grazing, heads nodding. The herds moved forward like slow rivers. There was scarcely any sound save the melancholy cry of a bird of prey. This was the stillness of the eternal beginning, the world as it has always been in the state of non-being, for until then no one had been present to know what it was that it was this world. I walked away from my companions until I could put them out of sight, and savored the feeling of being entirely alone. There I was now, the first human being to recognize that this was the world, but who did not know that in this moment he had finally really created it. There was the cosmic meaning of consciousness became there the cosmic meaning of consciousness became overwhelmingly clear to me. What nature leaves imperfect, the art perfects, says the alchemists. Man, I, in an invisible act of creation, put the stamp of perfection on the world by giving it objective existence. This act we usually ascribe to the Creator alone, without considering that in so far doing we view life as a machine calculated down to the last detail, which, along with the human psyche, runs on senselessly, obeying foreknown and predetermined rules. In such a cheerless clockwork fantasy, there is no drama of man, world, and God. There is no new day leading to new shores, but only the dreariness of calculated processes. My old Pueblo friend came to mind. He thought that the raison d'etre of his Pueblo had been to help their father, the sun, to cross the sky each day. I had envied him for the fullness of the meaning in that belief, and had been looking about without hope for a myth of our own. Now I knew what it was, and knew even more that man is indispensable for the completion of creation, that in fact he himself is the second creator of the world, who alone has given to the world its objective existence, without which, unheard, unseen, silently eating, giving birth, dying, heads nodding through hundreds of millions of years, it would have gone on in the profoundest night of non-being down to the unknown end. Human consciousness created objective existence and meaning, and man found his indispensable place in the great process of being. By the Uganda Railroad, which was then being built, we traveled to its provisional terminus, station Sigistifore. The boys unloaded our quantities of equipment. I sat down on a chop box, a crate containing provisions, each one a man's headload, and lit a pipe, meditating on the fact that here we had, as it were, reached the edge of the oikumeme, the uninhabited earth. The inhabited earth, from which trails stretched endlessly over the continent. After a while, an elderly Englishman, obviously a squatter, joined me, sat down, and likewise took up a pipe. He asked me where we were going. When I outlined our various destinations, he asked, "Is this the first time you have been in Africa?" "I have been here for 40 years. "Yes," I told him, "at least in this part of Africa." "Then may I give you a piece of advice? You know, mister, this here country is not man's country, it's God's country. So if anything should happen, just sit down and don't worry." Whereupon he rose, and without another word, was lost in the horde of black people swarming around us. His words struck me as somehow significant, and I tried to visualize the psychological state from which they had sprung. Evidently they represented the quintessence of his experience. Not man, but God was in command here. In other words, not well in intention, but inscrutable design. I had not come to the end of my meditation when our two automobiles were ready to set off. Our party piled in with the baggage, 8 men strong, and we held on as best we could. The shaking I received for the next several hours left no room for reflection. It was much farther than I thought to the next settlement. Kakamigas, seat of the D.C. District Commissioner, headquarters of a small garrison of the African Rifles, and site of a hospital and, fantastically enough, a small insane asylum. Everything approached, and suddenly night had fallen. Evening approached, and suddenly night had fallen. All at once a tropical storm came up, and almost incessant flashes of lightning, thunder, and a cloudburst which instantly soaked us from head to foot and made every brook a raging torrent. It was half an hour after midnight, with the sky beginning to clear, when we reached Kakamigas. We were exhausted, and the D.C. helpfully received us with whiskey in his drawing room. A jolly and oh so welcome fire was burning in the fireplace. In the center of the handsome room stood a large table, with a display of English journals. The place might easily have been a country house in Sussex. In my tiredness, I no longer knew whether I had been transported from reality into a dream, or from dream into reality. Then we still had to pitch our tents, not for the first time. Luckily, nothing was missing. Next morning, I awoke with a touch of feverish laryngitis and had to stay in bed for a day. To this circumstance I owe my memorable acquaintance with the brain fever bird, a creature remarkable for being able to sing a correct scale, but leaving out the last note and starting again from the beginning. To listen to this when one is down with a fever is to have one's nerves strained to the breaking point. Another feathered inhabitant of the banana plantation has a cry which consists of two of the sweetest and the most melodious flute tones, with a third, frightful sour note for an ending. What nature leaves imperfected. The song of the "bell bird," however, was one of unalloyed beauty. When it sang, it was as though a bell were drifting along the horizon. Next day, with the aid of the D.C., we rounded up our column of bearers, which was supplanted by a military escort of 3 askaris. And now began the trek to Mount Elgon, whose 14,000-foot crater wall we soon saw on the horizon. The track led through relatively dry, savanna covered with umbrella acacias. The whole district was densely covered with small round tumuli between 6 and 8 feet high, old termite colonies. For travelers, there were rest houses along the track, round, grass-roofed, rammed earth huts, open and empty. At night, a burning lantern was placed in the entrance as protection against intruders. Our cook had no lantern, but was as compassionate. But as compensation, he had a miniature hut all to himself, with which he was highly pleased. But it nearly proved fatal to him. The previous day he had slaughtered in front of his hut a sheep, which we had brought for 5 Uganda shillings, and had prepared an excellent mutton chop for our evening meal. After dinner, while we were sitting around the fire smoking, we heard strange noises in the distance. The sounds came closer. They sounded now like the growling of bears, now like the barking and yapping of dogs. Then again the sounds began shrill, like shrieks and hysterical laughter. My first impression was, this is like the cosmic turn at Barnum and Bailey's. Before long, however, the scene became more menacing. We were surrounded on all sides by a huge pack of hungry hyenas who had obviously smelled the sheep's blood. They performed an infernal concert, and in the glow of the fire their eyes could be seen glittering from the tall elephant grass. In spite of our lofty knowledge of the nature of hyenas, which are alleged not to attack men, we did not feel altogether sure for ourselves, and suddenly a frightful human scream came from behind the rest house. We snatched up our arms, a 9mm man-lighter rifle and a shotgun, and fired several rounds in the direction of those glittering lights. As we did so, our cook came rushing panic-stricken into our midst, and babbled that a Fizi had come into his hut and almost killed him. The whole camp was in an uproar. The excitement, it seemed, so frightened the pack of hyenas that they quit the scene, protesting noisily. The bears went on laughing for a long time afterwards. The rest of the night passed quickly without further disturbance. Early next morning the local chief appeared with a gift of 2 chickens and a basketful of eggs. He implored us to stay another day to shoot the hyenas. The day before, he said, they had dragged out an old man asleep in his hut and eaten him. De Africa nihil sirtum. At daybreak, roars of laughter began again in the boys' quarters. It appeared that they were reenacting the events of the night. One of them played the sleeping cook, and one of the soldiers played the creeping hyena, approaching the sleeper with murderous intent. This playlet was repeated I don't know how many times to the utter delight of the audience. From then on the cook bore the nickname Fizi. We three whites already had our trademarks. My friend, the Englishman, they called Redneck. And to the native mind, all Englishmen had rednecks. The American, who sported an impressive wardrobe, was known as Buona Maridadi, the dapper gentleman. Because I already had gray hair at the time, I was then 50, I was Mzee, the old man, and was regarded as 100 years old. Advanced ages are rare in those parts. I saw very few white-haired men. Mzee is also the title of honor, and was accorded to me in my capacity as head of the Bug Bughishu Psychological Expedition, an appellation imposed by the Foreign Office in London as a lucus a non lucendo. We did visit the Bugishus, but spent much longer time with the Elgonius. All in all, Africans proved to be excellent judges of character. One of their avenues to insight lay in their talent for mimicry. They could imitate with astonishing accuracy the manner of expression, the gestures, the gaits of people, thus, to all intents and purposes, slipping into their skins. I found their understanding of the emotional nature of others altogether surprising. I would always take the time to engage in the long palavers for which they had pronounced profound pronounced fondness. In this way I learned a great deal. Our traveling semi-officially proved advantageous, since in this way we found it easier to recruit bearers, and we were also given a military escort. The latter was by no means superfluous, since we were going to travel in territories that were not under white control. A corporal and 2 privates accompanied our safari to Mount Elgon. We could not help the chief by hunting the hyenas, and continued on our way after the adventure. The terrain sloped gently upward. Signs of tertiary lava beds increased. We passed through glorious sketches of jungle with huge Nundi flame trees flaunting their red blossoms. Enormous beetles and even larger brilliant colored butterflies enlivened the clearings and the edges of the jungle. Branches were shaken by inquisitive monkeys as we advanced further into the bush. It was a paradisal world. Most of the way, we still traversed flat savanna with deep red soil. We trampled mostly along the native trails which meandered in striking sharp turns. Our route led us into the Nundi region, through the Nundi forest, a sizable area of jungle. Without incident, we reached a rest house at the foot of Mount Elgon, which had been towering higher and higher above our head for days. Here the climb began. Along the narrow path, we were greeted by the local chief, who was the son of the Laibon, the medicine man. He rode a pony, the only horse we had seen so far. From him we learned that his tribe belonged to the Maasai, but lived in isolation here on the slopes of Mount Elgon. There a letter awaited us from the governor of Uganda, requesting us to take our protection and under our protection an English lady who was on her way back to Egypt via the Sudan. The governor was aware that we were following the same itinerary, and since we had already met the lady in Nairobi, we knew that she would be a congenial companion. Moreover, we were under considerable obligation to the governor for his having helped us in all sorts of ways. I mention this episode to suggest the subtle modes by which an archetype influences our actions. We were 3 men. That was a matter of pure chance. I had asked another friend of mine to join us, which would have made us a 4th, but circumstances had prevented him from accepting. That sufficed to produce an unconscious or fated constellation, the archetype of the triad, which calls for the 4th to complete it, as we have seen again and again in the history of this archetype. Since I am inclined to accept chance when it comes my way, I welcomed the lady to our group of 3 men. Hardy and intrepid, she proved a useful counterpoise to our one-sided masculinity. When one of our party came down with a bad case of tropical malaria, we were grateful of the experience she had acquired as a nurse during the First World War. After a few hours of climbing, we reached a lovely large clearing bisected by a clear, cool brook with a waterfall about 10 feet in height. The pool at the bottom of the waterfall became our bath. Our campsite was situated about 300 yards away on a gentle, dry slope, swallowed by umbrella acacias. Nearby, that is, about 15 minutes' walk away, was a native kraal, which consisted of a few huts and a boma, a yard surrounded by a hedge of wait-a-bit thorn. The kraal provided us with our water-bearers, a woman and her 2 half-grown daughters, who were naked except for a belt of cowries. They were chocolate brown and strikingly pretty, with fine, slim figures and an aristocratic leisureliness about their movements. It was a pleasure for me each morning to hear the soft clang clang of their iron ankle rings as they came up from the brook, and soon afterwards to see their swaying gait as they emerged from the tall yellow elephant grass, balancing the amphora of water on their heads. They were adorned with ankle rings, brass bracelets and necklaces, earrings of copper or wood in the shape of small spools. Their lower lips were pierced with either a bone or an iron nail. They had very good manners and always greeted us with shy, charming smiles. With a single exception, which I shall mention shortly, I never spoke to a native woman, this being what was expected of me. As in southern Europe, men speak to men, women to women. Anything else signifies love-making. The white who goes in for this not only forfeits his authority, but runs a serious risk of quote-unquote going black. I observed several highly instructive examples of this. Quite often I heard the natives pass judgment upon certain whites. "He's a bad man." When I asked them why, their reply was, "He sleeps with our women." Among my Algonies, the men busied themselves with the cattle and with hunting. The women were identified with the shamba, a field of bananas, sweet potatoes, kaffir, grain, sorghum, and maize. They kept children, goats, and chickens in the same round hut in which the family lived. Their dignity and naturalness flow from their functions in the economy. They are intensely active business partners. The concept of equal rights for women is a product of an age in which such partnership has lost its meaning. Primitive society is regulated by an unconscious egoism and altruism. Both attitudes are wisely given their due. This unconscious order breaks up at once if any disturbance ensues, which has to be remedied by a conscious act. It gives me pleasure to recall one of my most important informants on family relations among the Algonyi. He was a strikingly handsome youth by the name of Gibroat, the son of a chief, charming and distinguished in manners, whose confidence I had evidently won. To be sure, he gladly accepted my cigarettes, but he was not greedy for them, as the others were for all sorts of gifts. From time to time he would pay me a gentlemanly visit and tell me all sorts of interesting things. I felt that he had something in mind, some request that he somehow could not voice. Not until we had known each other for some time did he astonish me by asking me to meet his family. I know that he himself was unmarried, and that his parents were dead. The family in question was that of an elder sister. She was married as a second wife and had 4 children. Gibroat very much wanted me to pay her a visit, and so that she would have had the opportunity to meet me. Evidently, she filled the place of a mother in his life. I agreed because I hoped that this social way to obtain some insight into native family life. Madame était chez elle. She came out of the hut when we arrived and greeted me with utter naturalness. She was a good-looking woman, middle-aged, that is, about 30. Aside from the obligatory cowrie belt, she wore arm and ankle rings, some copper ornaments hanging from a greatly extended earlobe, and the skin of some small game animal over her breast. She had locked her 4 little mutotos in the hut. They peered out through the cracks at the door, giggling excitedly. At my request she let them out, but it took some time before they dared to emerge. She had the same excellent manners as her brother, who was beaming joyfully at the success of his coup. We did not sit down, since there was nowhere to sit, except on the dusty ground, which was covered with chicken droppings and goat pellets. The conversation moved in the conventional framework of semi-familiar drawing-room talk, revolving around family, children, house, and garden. Her elder co-wife, whose property bordered on hers, had 6 children. The boma of this sister was some 80 yards away. Approximately halfway between the 2 women's huts, at the apex of a triangle, stood the husband's hut, and behind that, about 50 yards away, a small hut occupied by the first wife's already grown son. Each of the 2 women had her own shamba. My hostess was obviously proud of hers. I had the feeling that the confidences and self-assurances her manner were founded on, to a great extent, upon her identity with her own wholeness, her private world, which was made up of children, house, small livestock, shamba, and, last but not least, her not unattractive physique. The husband was referred to only in an elusive way. It seemed that he was sometimes here, sometimes not here. At the moment he was staying at some unknown place. My hostess was plainly and unproblematically the embodiment of stability, a veritable pied-à-terre for her husband. The question did not seem to be whether or not he was there, but whether or not she was present in her wholeness, providing a geomagnetic center for the husband who wandered over the land with his herds. What goes on in the inner interior of these simple, quote-unquote, simple souls is not conscious, and is therefore unknown, and we can only deduce it from comparative evidence of quote-unquote advanced European differentiation. I asked myself whether the growing masculinization of the white woman is not connected with the loss of her natural wholeness, shamba, children, livestock, house of her own, hearth fire, whether it is not a compensation for her impoverishment, and whether the feminization of the white man is not a further consequence. The more rational the polity, the more blurred is the difference between the sexes. The role homosexuality plays in modern society is enormous. It is partly the consequence of the mother complex, partly a purposive phenomenon, a prevention of reproduction. My companions and I had the good fortune to taste the world of Africa and its incredible beauty and its equally incredible suffering before the end came. Our camp proved to be one of the loveliest interludes in my life. I enjoyed the "divine peace" of a still primitive country. Never had I seen so clearly "man and other animals" Herodotus. Thousands of miles lay between me and Europe, mother of all demons. The demons could not reach me here. There were no telegrams, no telephone calls, no letters, no visitors. My liberated psyche forces poured blissfully back to the primitive expanses. It was easy for us to arrange a palaver every morning with the natives, who squatted all day along our camp and watched our doings with never-fading interest. My headman, Ibrahim, had initiated me into the etiquette of the palaver. All the men, the women never came near, had to sit on the ground. Ibrahim had obtained for me a small four-legged chief stool of mahogany on which I had to sit. Then I began with an address and set forth the shauri, that is, the agenda of the palaver. Most of the Africans spoke a tolerable pidgin Swahili, and I for my part would manage to speak to them by making ample use of a small dictionary. This little book was the object of unvarying admiration. My limited vocabulary imposed upon me a needful simplicity. Upon the conversation resembled an amusing game of guessing riddles, for which reason the palavers enjoyed great popularity. The sessions seldom lasted longer than an hour or an hour and a half, because the men grew very visibly tired and would complain with dramatic gestures, "Ah, we're so tired." I was naturally much interested in the natives' dreams, but at first could not get any of them to tell me any. I offered small rewards, cigarettes, matches, safety pins, and such things, which they were eager to have, but nothing helped. I could never completely explain their shyness about telling dreams. I suspect the reason was fear and distrust. It is well known that Africans are afraid of being photographed. They fear that anyone who takes a picture of them is robbing them of their soul, and perhaps they likewise fear that harm may come to them from anyone who has knowledge of their dreams. This incidentally does not appear to our boys, who are coastal Somalis and Swahilis. They had an Arab dream book which they daily consulted during the trek. If they were in doubt about an interpretation, they would actually come to me for advice. They termed me "man of the book" because of my knowledge of the Koran. To their minds, I was a disguised Mohammedan. One time we had a palaver with the Laban, the old medicine man. He appeared in a splendid cloak made of the skins of blue monkeys, a valuable article of display. When I asked him about his dreams, he answered with tears in his eyes. In the old days, the Labans had dreams, and knew whether there is a war or sickness, or whether rains come, and when the herds should be driven. His father, too, had still dreamed. But since the whites were in Africa, he said, no one has dreams any more. Dreams were no longer needed, because now the English knew everything. His reply showed me that the medicine man had lost his raison d'être. The divine voice which had counseled the tribe was no longer needed, because the English know better. Formerly, the medicine man had negotiated with the gods or the power of destiny, and had advised his people. He exerted great influence, just as in the ancient Greek the word of the Pythia possessed the highest authority. Now the medicine man's authority was replaced by that of the DC. The value of life now lay wholly in this world, and it seemed to me only a question of time and of vitality of the black race before the Africans would become conscious of the importance of their physical power. Far from being an imposing personality, our Laban was only a somewhat tearful old gentleman. He was the living embodiment of the spreading disintegration of the undermined, outmodelled, and unrestorable world. On numerous occasions I brought the conversation around to the noumena, especially to rites and ceremonies. Concerning these I had only a single piece of evidence. In front of an empty hut in the middle of a busy village street, I had seen a carefully swept spot several yards in diameter. In the center lay a cowrie belt, arm and ankle rings, earrings, and the shards of all sorts of pots, and a digging stick. All that we were able to learn about this was the fact that a woman had died in the hut. Nothing whatsoever was said about the funeral. In the palaver, the people assured me what considerable emphasis that their neighbors to the west with considerable emphasis. The neighbors to the west were bad people. If someone died there, the next village was informed, and in the evening the body was brought to the midpoint between the two villages. From the other side, presents of various sorts were brought to the same spot, and in the morning the corpse was no longer there. It was plainly insinuated that the other villages devoured the dead. Such things never happen among the Algonyi, they said. To be sure, their dead were laid out in the bush, where the hyenas took care of them in the course of the night. In point of fact, we never found any signs of burials of the dead. I was informed, however, that when a man dies, his body is placed on the floor in the middle of the hut. The Laban walks around the body, sprinkling milk from a bowl on the floor, murmuring, Ayik, Adhisha, Adhisha, Ayik. I knew the meaning of these words from a memorable palaver that had taken place earlier. At the end of the palaver, an old man had suddenly exclaimed, "In the morning, when the sun comes, we go out of the huts and spit on our hands and hold them up in the sun." I had him show me the ceremony and described it exactly. They held their hands in front of their mouths, spat or blew vigorously, and then turned their palms up toward the sun. I asked them what it meant, and they blew or spat in their hands. My question was in vain. "We've always done it," they said. It was impossible to obtain any explanation, and I realized that knew they actually knew only that they did it, and not what they were doing. They themselves saw no meaning in this action. But we, too, perform ceremonies without realizing what we are doing, such as lighting Christmas tree candles, hiding Easter eggs, etc. The old man said that this was the true religion of all peoples, that of Kevverorondis, all Bugandu, all tribes as far as the eye could see, from the mountain and the endlessly further, worshipped Adhista, that is, sun, at the moment of rising. Only then was the sun Munga god, the first delicate golden crescent of the new moon, in the purple of the western sky, was also God, but only at that time, otherwise not. Evidently, the meaning of the Algonyi ceremony was that an offering was made to the sun divinity at the moment of its rising. If the gift was spittle, it was a substance which, in the view of the primitive, contains the personal mana, the power of healing, magic, and life. If it is breath, then it is oroho, Arabic oruch, Hebrew horaunch, Greek pneuma, wind and spirit. The act was therefore saying, "I offer to God my living soul." It was a wordless acting out prayer, which might equally well be rendered, "Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit." Besides Adhista, the Algonyi, we were further informed, also venerated Ayik, the spirit who dwells in the earth, and is a shaitan, devil. He is the creator of fear, a cold wind, who lies in wait for the nocturnal traveler. The old man whistled a kind of Loki motif to convey vividly how the Ayik creeps through the tall, mysterious grass in the bush. In general, the people asseverated that the Creator had made everything good and beautiful. He was beyond good and evil. He was Mazuri, that is, beautiful, and everything he did was Mazuri. When I asked, "But what about the wicked animals who kill your cattle?" they said, "The lion is good and beautiful, and your horrible disease," they said, "you lie in the sun, and it is good." I was impressed by this optimism, but at 6 o'clock in the evening this optimism was suddenly over, as I soon discovered. From sunset on, it was a different world, a dark world of Agik, of evil, danger, and fear. The optimistic philosophy gave way to the fear of ghosts and magical practices intended to secure protection from evil. Without any inner contradiction, the optimism returned at dawn. It was a profoundly stirring experience for me to find at the source of the Nile this reminder of the ancient Egyptian conception of the two acolytes of Osiris, Horus, and Set. Here, evidently, was a primordial African experience that had flowed down to the coasts of the Mediterranean along with the sacred waters of the Nile. Adhishta, the rising sun, the principle of light, like Horus, Arik, the principle of darkness, the breeder of fear. In the simple rites performed for the dead, the Laibon's words and his sprinkling of milk unite the opposite. He simultaneously sacrifices to those two principles, which are of equal power and significance since the time of their dominance, the rule of day and of night, each visibly lasting for 12 hours. The important thing, however, is the moment when, with the typical suddenness of the tropics, the first ray of light shoots forth like an arrow and night passes into life-filled light. The sunrise in these latitudes was a phenomenon that overwhelmed me anew every day. The drama of it lay less in the splendor of the sun's shooting up over the horizon than in what happened afterwards. I formed a habit of taking my camp stool and sitting under an umbrella acacia just before dawn. Before me, at the bottom of the little valley, lay a dark, almost black-green strip of jungle, with the rim of the plateau on the opposite side of the valley towering above it. At first, the contrasts between light and darkness would be extremely sharp. Then objects would assume contour and emerge into the light, which seemed to fill the valley with a complete brightness. The horizon became radiantly white. Gradually, the swelling light seemed to penetrate into the very structure of objects, which became illuminated from within until at last they shone translucently, like bits of colored glass. Everything turned to flaming crystal. The cry of the bellbird rang around the horizon. In such moments, I felt as if I were inside a temple. It was the most sacred hour of the day. I drank in this glory with insatiable delight, or rather, in a timeless ecstasy. Near my observation point was a high cliff inhabited by big baboons. Every morning they sat quietly, almost motionless, on the ridge of the cliff facing the sun, whereas throughout the rest of the day they raged noisily through the forest, screeching and chattering. Like me, they seemed to be waiting for the sunrise. They reminded me of the great baboons of the temple of Abu Simbel in Egypt, which performs a gesture of adoration. They tell the same story. For untold ages, people have worshipped the great God who redeems the world by rising out of the darkness as a radiant light in the heavens. At that time, I understood that within the soul of its primordial beginnings there has been a desire for light and an irrepressible urge to rise out of primal darkness. When the great night comes, everything takes on a note of deep dejection, and every soul is seized by an inexpressible longing for light. That is the pent-up feeling that can be detected in the eyes of primitives and also in the eyes of animals. There is a sadness in animals' eyes, and we never know whether that sadness is bound up with the soul of the animal or is a poignant message which speaks to us out of that still unconscious existence. That sadness also reflects the moods of Africa, the experience of its solitudes. It is a maternal mystery, this primordial darkness. That is why the sun's birth in the morning strikes the natives with so overwhelmingly meaningful. The moment in which the light comes is God. That moment brings redemption, release. To say that the sun is God is to blur and forget the archetypal experience of that moment. We are glad that the night when the spirits are abroad is over now, the natives will say, but that is already a rationalization. In reality, a darkness altogether different from natural night broods over the land. It is the psychic primal night, which is the same today as it has been for countless millions of years. The longing for light is the longing for consciousness. Our blissful stay at Mount Elgon neared its end. With heavy hearts we struck our tents, promising ourselves we would return. I would not have brought myself to think that this would be the first and the last time I would experience the unlooked-for glory. Since then, gold has been discovered near Kakamigas, mining has begun, and the Mau Mau movement has already risen among these innocent and friendly natives, and we too have known a rude awakening from the dream of civilization. We trekked along the southern slope of Mount Elgon. Gradually the character of the landscape changed. Higher mountains covered with dense jungle verged on the plain. The color of the inhabitants grew blacker. Their bodies became clumsier and more massive, lacking the grace of the Maasai. We were entering the territory of the Buishu, where we stayed some time in a rest house of a Bunambale. It is situated at a high altitude, and we had a splendid view of the broad Nile Valley. From there we went on to Mambala, where we were met by two Ford trucks that took us to Jinja on Lake Victoria. We loaded our bags onto a train on the narrow gauge railroad. Once every 2 weeks it went to Lake Kyoga, a paddle wheel steamer whose boiler was fired by wood picked us up, and, after a number of incidents, brought us to Masidini, Masid, Masindi Port, which was situated on the plateau that separated Lake Kyoga from um, Albert Nyanza. In a village on the way from Lake Albert to Rejaf in the Sudan, we had a very exciting experience. The local chief, a tall, still, quiet young man, appeared with his retinue. These were the blackest Africans I had ever seen. There was something about the group which was not exactly reassuring. The Mamour, El Mamour, literally prefect or governor, the Mamour of Nimule, had given us 3 askaris as an escort, but I saw that they, as well as our own boys, did not feel at all easy. After all, they had only 3 cartridges for each of their rifles. Their presence, consequently, was merely symbolic gesture on the part of the government. When the chief proposed that he give a ngoma, a dance, in that evening, I assented gladly. I hoped that the frolic would bring their better nature to the fore. Night had fallen, and we were all longing for sleep, when we heard drums and horn blasts. Some 60 men appeared, martially equipped with flashing lances, clubs, and swords. They were followed at some distance by the women and children. Even the infants were present, carried on their mothers' backs. This was obviously to be a grand social occasion. In spite of the heat, which still hovered around 93 degrees, a big fire was kindled, and women and children formed a circle around it. The men formed an outer ring around them, and, as I once observed, just like a nervous herd of elephants do. I did not know whether I ought to feel pleased or anxious about this mass display. I looked around for our boys and the government soldiers. They had vanished completely from the camp. As a gesture of goodwill, I distributed cigarettes, matches, and safety pins. The men's chorus began to sing vigorous bellicose melodies, not unharmonious, but at the same time beginning to swing their legs. The women and children tripped around the fire, and the men danced toward it, waving their weapons, and then drew them back again, and then advanced anew amid savage singing, drumming, and trumpeting. It was a wild and stirring scene, bathed in the glow of fire and magical moonlight. My English friend and I sprang to our feet and mingled with the dancers. I swung my rhinoceros whip, the only weapon I had, and danced with them. By their beaming faces I could see they approved of our taking part. Their zeal redoubled, the whole company stamping, sang, shouted, sweating profusely. Gradually the rhythm of the dance and the drumming accelerated. In dances such as these, accompanied by such music, the Africans easily fall into a virtual state of possession. This was the case now. As 11 o'clock approached, their excitement began to get out of bounds, and suddenly the whole affair took on a highly curious aspect. The dancers were being transformed into a wild horde, and I became worried about how it would end. I signaled to the chief that it was time to stop, but he and his people ought to go to sleep, but he kept just wanting just another one. I remembered that a country of mine, one of the Saracen cousins, had an exploratory expedition in Celebes, and had been struck by a stray spear in the course of such a ngoma, and so, disregarding the chief's pleas, I called the people together, distributed cigarettes, and made the gesture of sleeping. Then I swung my rhinoceros whip threateningly, but at the same time laughing for lack of any better language. I swore at them loudly in Swiss German that this was enough and they must go home to bed and sleep now. It was apparent to the people that I was just, to some extent, pretending to be angry, but that seemed to have struck just the right note. General laughter arose, campering, and they scattered in all directions and vanished into the night. For a long time we heard their jovial howls and drumming in the distance. At last silence fell, and we dropped into the sleep of the exhaustion. Our trek came to an end in Arijaf on the Nile. There we stowed our gear on a paddle wheel steamer, which just succeeded in docking at Rajif. The water level was almost too low for it. By this time I was feeling burdened by all that I had experienced. 1,000 thoughts were whirling about me, and it became painfully clear to me that my capacity to digest new impressions was quickly approaching its limits. The thing to do was to go over all my observations and experiences and discover their inner connections. I had written down everything worth noting. During the entire trip, my dreams stubbornly followed the tactic of ignoring Africa. They drew exclusively upon scenes from home, and thus seemed to say that they considered, if it is permissible to personify the unconscious process in this extent, the African journey not as something real, but rather as a symptomatic or symbolic act. Even the most impressive events of the trip were rigorously excluded from my dreams. Only once during the entire exhibition did I dream of an African. His face appeared curiously familiar to me, but I had to reflect a long time before I could determine that I had met him before. Finally, it came to me. He had been my barber in Chattanooga, Tennessee, an American black man. In the dream, he was holding a tremendous red-hot curling iron to my head, intending to make my hair kinky, that is, to give me a black person's hair. I could already feel the painful heat, and awoke with a sense of terror. I took this dream as a warning from the unconscious. It was saying that the primitive was a danger to me. At that time, I was obviously all too close to quote-unquote going black. I was suffering from an attack of sandfly fever, which probably reduced my psychic resistance. Uh, in order to represent an African threatening me, my unconscious had invoked a 12-year-old memory of my black American barber in America, just in order to avoid any reminder of the present. This curious behavior of my dreams corresponds incidentally to a phenomenon which was noted during the First World War. Soldiers in the field dreamt far less of the war than they did of their homes. Military psychiatrists considered it a basic principle that a man should be pulled out of the front lines when he started dreaming too much of the war scenes, for that meant he no longer possessed any psychic defense against the impressions from the outside. Parallel to my involvement in this demanding African environment, an interior line was being successfully secured within my dreams. The dreams dealt with my personal problems. The only thing I could conclude from this was that my European personality must under all circumstances be preserved intact. To my astonishment, the suspicion dawned on me that I had undertaken my African adventure with the secret purpose of escaping from Europe and its complex of problems, even at the risk of remaining in Africa, as so many had done before me, and as so many were doing at that very time. The trip revealed itself as less an investigation of primitive psychology, Bogishu Psychological Expedition, BPE, black letters on the chop boxes, than a probing into the rather embarrassing question, what is going to happen to Jung, the psychologist, in the wilds of Africa? This was a question I had constantly sought to evade in spite of my intellectual intention to study the Europeans' reaction to primitive conditions. It became clear to me that this study had not been so much an objective scientific project as an intensely personal one, and that any attempt to go deeper into it touched every possible sore spot in my own psychology. I had to admit to myself that it was scarcely the Wembley expedition which had begotten my decision to travel, but rather the fact that the atmosphere had become too highly charged for me in Europe. Amid such thoughts, I glided on the peaceful waters of the Nile towards the north, towards Europe, towards the future. The voyage ended at Khartoum. There Egypt began, and thus I followed my desire and my plan to approach this cultural realm not from the west, from the distinct direction of Europe and Greece, but from the south, from the sources of the Nile. I was less interested in the complex Asiatic elements in Egyptian culture than in the Hamitic contribution. By following the geographical course of the Nile, and hence the stream of time, I could find out something about that for myself. My greatest illumination in this respect has been my discovery of the Horus principle among the Algonyi. That whole episode and all that it has meant was dramatically called to mind again when I saw the sculpture Cynocephali, dog-faced baboons, of Abu Simbel, the southern gate of Egypt. The myth of Horus is the age-old story of the newly risen divine light. It is a myth which must have been told after human culture, that is, consciousness, had for the first time released men from the darkness of prehistoric times. Thus the journey from the heart of Africa to Egypt became for me a kind of drama in the birth of light. That drama was intensely connected with my psychology. I realized this, but felt incapable of formulating it in words. I had not known in advance what Africa would give me, but here lay the satisfying answer, the fulfilling experience. It was worth more to me than any ethnological yield would have been. any collection of weapons, ornaments, pottery, or hunting trophies. I had wanted to know how Africa would affect me, and I had found out. 4. India. Footnote. On his return from India, Jung contributed 2 articles to the magazine Asia, New York, January and February issues, 1939. Quote, "The dreamlike world of India" and, quote, "what India can teach us," unquote. They are included in Civilization in Transition. My journey to India in 1938 was not taken on my own initiative. It arose out of an invitation from the British government of India to take part in the celebrations connected to the 25th anniversary of the University of Calcutta. By that time, I had read a great deal about Indian philosophy and religious history, and was deeply convinced of the value of Oriental wisdom. But I had to travel in order to form my own conclusions, and remained within myself like a homunculus in the retort. India affected me like a dream, for I was and remained in search of myself, of the truth particular to myself, of the truth peculiar to myself, not particular. The journey formed an intermezzo in the intensive study of the alchemical philosophy on which I was engaged at the time. This had so strong a grip on me that I took along the first volume of the Theatrum Chemicium of 1602, which contains the principal writings of Gerardus Dornius. In the course of the voyage, I studied the book from beginning to end. Thus it was that this material belonging to the fundamental strata of European thought was constantly counterpointed by my impression of the foreign mentality and culture. Both had emerged from original psychic experiences of the unconscious, and therefore had produced the same, similar, or at least comparable insights. India gave me my first direct experience of an alien, highly differentiated culture. Altogether different elements had ruled my Central African journey. Culture had not predominated. As for North America, I had never had the opportunity there to talk with a person capable of putting his culture into words. In India, however, I had the chance to speak with representatives of the Indian mentality and to compare it with the European. I had searching talks with S. Subramanya Iyer, the guru of the Maharaja of Mysore, whose guest I was for some time, also with many others whose names unfortunately have escaped me. On the other hand, I studiously avoided all so-called holy men. I did so because I had to make do with my own truth, and not accept from others what I could not attain on my own. I would have felt it as a theft if I had attempted to learn from the holy men and to accept their truth for myself. Neither in Europe can I make any borrowings from the East, but must shape my life out for myself, out of what my inner being tells me, or what nature brings to me. In India, I was principally concerned with the question of the psychological nature of evil. I had been very much impressed by the way this problem is integrated in Indian spiritual life, and I saw it in a new light. In a conversation with a cultivated Chinese, I was also impressed again and again by the fact that these people are able to integrate so-called evil without losing face. In the West, we cannot do this. For the Oriental, the problem of mortality does not appear to take first place, as it does for us. To the Asian, good and evil are meaningfully contained in nature and are merely varying degrees of the same thing. I saw the Indian spirituality contains as much of the evil as of good. The Christian strives for good and succumbs to evil. The Indian feels himself to be outside of good and evil and seeks to realize the state by meditation or yoga. My objection is that, given such an attitude, neither good nor evil takes on any real outline, and this produces a certain stasis. Sorry, not status. One does not really believe in evil. One does not really have to believe in good. Good or evil are then regarded at most as my good or my evil, as whatever seems to be good or evil, which leaves us with the paradoxical statement that Indian spirituality lacks both evil and good, and is so burdened by contradictions that it needs Nirdvandva, the liberation from opposites and from the 10,000 things. The Indian's goal is not moral perfection, but the condition of Nirvana. I think he means nirvana. He wishes to free himself from nature in keeping with this aim. He seeks in meditation the condition of imagelessness and emptiness. I, on the other hand, wish to persist in the state of lively contemplation of nature and of the psychic images. I want to be freed neither from human beings, nor from myself, nor from nature, for all these appear to me the greatest of miracles. Nature, the psyche, and life appears to me like divinity unfolded. But what more could I wish for? To me, the supreme meaning of being can consist only in the fact that it is, not that it is not or is no longer. To me, there is no liberation à tout prix. I cannot, at any price, I cannot be liberated from anything that I do not possess, have not done, or experienced. Real liberation becomes possibly for me only when I have done all that I was able to do, when I have completely devoted myself to a thing or participated in it to the utmost. If I withdraw from participation, I am virtually amputating the corresponding parts of my psyche. Naturally, there may be good reasons for my not immersing myself in a given experience, but then I am forced to confess my inability and must know that I may have neglected to do something of vital importance. In this way, I make amends for the lack of any positive act by the clear knowledge of my incompetence. A man who has not passed through the inferno of his passions has never overcome them. They then dwell in the house next door, and at any moment a flame may dart out and set fire to his own house. Whenever we give up, leave behind, and forget too much, there is always the danger of the things we have neglected will return with added force. In Konarak, Orissa, I met a pandit who obligingly offered to come with me on my visit to the temple and the great temple car. The pagoda is covered from base to pinnacle with exquisitely obscene sculptures. We talked for a long time about this extraordinary fact, and he explained to me as a means to achieve spiritualization. I objected, pointing to a group of young peasants who were standing open-mouthed before the monument, admiring these splendors, and that such young men were scarcely undergoing spiritualization at the moment, but were much more likely having their heads filled with sexual fantasies, whereupon he replied, "But that is just the point. How can they ever become spiritualized if they do not first fulfill their karma? These admittedly obscene images are here for the very purpose of recalling to the people their dharma, the law. Otherwise these unconscious fellows might forget it." I thought it was an odd notion that young men might forget their sexuality like animals out of running time. My sage, however, resolutely maintained that they were as unconscious as animals and actually in need of urgent admonishments. To this end, he said, before they set foot inside the temple, they were reminded of their dharma by the existing decorations, for unless they were made conscious of their dharma and fulfilled it, they could not partake of spiritualization. As we entered through the gate of the temple, my companion pointed to the two temptresses, such as of two dancing girls, which with seductively curved hips, who smilingly greeted all who entered. "Do you see the two dancing girls?" he said. "Their meaning is the same. Naturally, this does not apply to people who, like you and me, for we have attained a level of consciousness which is above this sort of thing. But for these peasant boys it is an indispensable instruction and admonishment." When we left the temple and were walking along the Lingam lane, he suddenly said, "Do you see those stones? Do you know what they mean? I want to tell you a great secret." I was astonished, for I had thought that the phallic nature of these monuments was known to every child. But he whispered into my ear, with the greatest seriousness, "These stones are men's private parts." I had expected him to tell me that they signified the great gods Shiva. I looked at him dumbfounded, and he only nodded self-importantly as if to say, "Yes, this is how it is. No doubt you in your European ignorance would never have thought so." When I told the story to Heinrich Zimmer, he exclaimed in delight, "At last I have heard something real about India for a change." When I visited the stupas of Sachi, where Buddha delivered his fire sermon, I was overcome by a strong emotion of the kind that frequently develops in me when I encounter a thing, person, or idea of whose significance I am still unconscious. The stupas are situated on a rocky hill, whose peak can be reached by a pleasant path of great stone slabs laid down through a green meadow. The stupas are tombs or containers of relics, hemispherical in shape like two gigantic rice bowls placed one on top of the other, concavity upon concavity, according to the precepts of the Buddha himself in the Parinibbana Sutta. The British have done their restoration work in the most respectful spirit. The largest of these buildings is surrounded by a wall which has 4 elaborate gates. You come in by one of these, and the path turns to the left and then leads to a clockwise circumambulation around the stupa. At the 4 cardinal points stands the statues of the Buddha. When you have completed one of circumambulation, you enter a second, higher circuit, which runs in the same direction. The distant prospect over the plain, the stupas themselves, the temple ruins, and the solitary stillness of the holy site held me in a spell. I took leave of my companion and submerged myself in the overpowering mood of the place. After a while I heard rhythmic gong tones approaching from the distance. A group of Japanese pilgrims came marching up, one behind the other, each striking a small gong. They were beating up the rhythm of the age-old prayer, Om Mani Padme Hum, the stroke of the gong falling on the Om. Outside the stupas they bowed low and then passed through the gate. There they bowed again before the statue of the Buddha, intonating a choral-like song. They completed the double circumambulation, singing a hymn before each statue of the Buddha. As I watched them, my mind and spirit were with them, and something within me silently thanked them for having so wonderfully come to the aid of my inarticulated feelings. The intensity of my emotion showed that the hill of Sanshi meant something central to me. A new side of Buddhism was revealed to me there. I grasped the life of the Buddha as the reality of the self, which has broken through and laid claim to a personal life. For Buddha, the self stands above all gods, an unus mundus, which represents the essence of human existence, of the world as a whole. The self embodies both the aspect of the intrinsic being and the aspect of the being known, without which no world exists. Buddha saw and grasped the cosmogonic dignity of human consciousness. For that reason he saw clearly that if a man succeeded in extinguishing this light, the world would sink into nothingness. Schopenhauer's great achievement lay in his also recognizing this, or rediscovering it independently. Christ, like Buddha, is an embodiment of the self, but in an altogether different sense. Both stood for an overcoming of the world, Buddha out of rational insight, Christ as a foredoomed sacrifice. In Christianity, more is suffered. In Buddhism, more is seen and done. Both paths are right. But in the Indian sense, Buddha is the more complete human being. He is an historical personality and therefore easier for men to understand. Christ is at once a historical man and God, and therefore much more difficult to comprehend. At bottom, he was not comprehensible even to himself. He knew only that he had to sacrifice himself, that this course was imposed upon him from within. His sacrifice happened to him like an act of destiny. Buddha lived out his life and died in an advanced age, whereas Christ's activity as Christ probably lasted no more than a year. Later, Buddhism underwent the same transformation as Christianity. Buddha came, as it were, the image of the development of the self. He became a model for men to imitate, whereas actually he had preached that by overcoming the Nidana chain, every human being could become an illuminated a Buddha. Similarly, in Christianity, Christ is an exemplar who dwells in every Christian as his integral personality, but historical trends led to the imitatio Christi, whereby the individual does not pursue his own destined road to wholeness, but attempts to imitate the way taken by Christ. Similarly, in the East, historical trends led to the devout imitation of the Buddha. That Buddha should have been a model to be imitated. That Buddha should have been a model to be imitated was in itself a weakening of his idea, just as the imitatio Christi was a forerunner of the fateful stasis in the evolution of the Christian idea. As Buddha, by virtue of his insight, was far in advance of the Brahma gods, so Christ called out to the Jews, "You are gods," John 10:34. But men are incapable of understanding what he meant. Instead, we find that the so-called Christian West, far from creating a new world, is moving with great strides toward the possibility of destroying the world we have. A footnote on the problem of imitatio, see Psychology and Alchemy, Part 1. End footnote. India honored me with 3 doctorates from Allahabad, Benares, and Calcutta, representatives of Islam, of Hinduism, and of British Indian medicine and science. It was a little too much of a good thing, and I needed a retreat. A 10-day spell in the hospital offered it to me, for in Calcutta I finally came down with dysentery. This was a blessed island in a wild sea of new impressions, and I found a place to stand on from which I could contemplate the 10,000 things in their bewildering turmoil. When I returned to the hotel, in tolerably good health, I had a dream so characteristic that I wish to set it down here. I found myself with a large number of my Zurich friends, acquaintances on an unknown island, presumably situated not far off from the coast of southern England. It was small and almost uninhabited. The island was narrow, with a strip of land about 20 miles long, running in the north-south direction. On the rocky coast of the southern end of the island was a medieval castle. We stood in the courtyard, a group of sightseeing tourists. Before us rose an imposing belfroy, through whose gate a wide stone staircase was visible. We could just manage to see it, terminated above a columned hall. This hall was dimly illuminated by candlelight. I understood that this was the castle of the Grail, and that this evening would be a, quote, celebration of the Grail here. This information seemed to be of a secret character, for a German professor among us, who strikingly resembled an old momsum, knew nothing about it. I talked most animatedly with him, and was impressed by his learning and sparkling intelligence. Only one thing disturbed me. He spoke constantly about a dead past, and lectured very learnedly on the relationship of the British to the French sources of the Grail story. Apparently he was not conscious of the meaning of the legend, nor of its living presentness, whereas I was intensely aware of both. Also, he did not seem to perceive our immediate actual surroundings, for he behaved as though he were in a classroom lecturing to his students. In vain I tried to call his attention to the peculiarity of the situation, and he did not see the stairs or the festive glow in the hall. I looked about somewhat helplessly, and discovered that I was standing in the wall of a tall castle. The lower portion of the wall was covered by a kind of trellis, not made of the usual wood, but of a black iron artfully formed into a grapevine complete with leaves, twining tendrils, and grapes. At intervals of 6 feet, on the horizontal branches were tiny houses, likewise of iron, like birdhouses. Suddenly I saw a movement in the foliage. At first it seemed to me that of a mouse, but then I distinctly saw a tiny iron-hooded gnome, a cuculatus, scurrying from one little house to the next. "Well," I exclaimed in astonishment to the professor, "now look at that, will you?" At that moment a hiatus occurred, and the dream changed. We, the same company as before, but without the professor, were outside of the castle in a treeless, rocky landscape. I knew that something had to happen, for the Grail was not yet in the castle, and still had to be celebrated that evening. It was said to be in the northern part of the island, hidden in a small uninhabited house, the only house there. I knew that it was our task to bring the Grail to the castle. There were about 6 of us who set out and tramped northward. After several hours of strenuous hiking, we reached the narrowest part of the island, and I discovered that the island was actually divided into 2 halves by an arm of the sea. At the smallest part of the strait, the width of the water was about 100 yards. The sun had set, and the night descended. Wearily we camped on the ground. The region was unpopulated and desolate. Far and wide there was not a tree or shrub, nothing but grass and rocks. There was no bridge, no boat. It was very cold. My companions fell asleep, one after the other, and I considered what could be done, and came to the conclusion that I alone must swim the channel and fetch the Grail. I took off my clothes, and at that point I awoke. Here was the essentially European dream emerging, when I had barely worked my way out of the overwhelming mass of Indian impressions. Some years before I had discovered that in many places in England the myth of the Grail was still a living thing, in spite of all the scholarship that had accumulated around this tradition. This fact has impressed me all the more when I realized the concordance between this poetic myth and what alchemy had to say about the Umum vas, the Umum medicina, and the Unus lapis. Myths which day has forgotten continue to be told by night, and powerful figures which consciousness has reduced to banality and ridiculous triviality are recognized again by poets and prophetically revived. Therefore, they can be recognized in changed form by the thoughtful person. The great ones of the past have not died as we think. They have merely changed their names. Small and slight, but great in might. The veiled Kabir enters a new house. That's a quoting. Small and slight, but great in might. Imperiously, the dream wiped away all the intense impressions of India and swept me back to the too long neglected concerns of the Occident, which had formerly been expressed in the quest of the Holy Grail as well as in the search for the philosopher's stone. I was taken out of the world of India and reminded that India was not my task, but only a part of the way, admittedly a significant which should carry me closer to my goal. It was as though the dream were asking me, "What are you doing in India? Rather seek for yourself and your fellows the healing vessel, the Servetur Mundi, which you urgently need, for your state is perilous. You are all in imminent danger of destroying all that the centuries have built up." Ceylon, the last stage of my journey, struck me as no longer India. There is already something of the South Seas about it, and a touch of paradise in which one can linger too long. Colombo is a busy international port, where every day between 5 and 6 o'clock a massive downpour descends from a clear sky. We soon left it behind and headed for the hilly country of the interior. There Kandy, the old royal city, is swathed in fine mists whose tepid humidity sustains a luxuriant vegetation. The Dalada Malegawa temple, which contains the relic of the holy tooth of Buddha, is small but radiates a special charm. I spent a considerable time in its library talking with the monks and looking at the texts of the Buddhist canon engraved on silver leaves. There I witnessed a memorable evening ceremony. Young men and women poured out enormous mounds of jasmine flowers in front of the altars, at the same time singing a prayer under their breath, a mantram. I thought they were praying to Buddha, but the monk was guiding me explained, "No, Buddha is no more. He is in nirvana. We cannot pray to him." They are saying, "This life is transitory as the beauty of these flowers. May, may my God share with me the merit of their offerings." God is Diwa, a guardian angel. As a prelude to the ceremony, a 1-hour drum concert was performed in the Mandapan, or what in India temples is called the Hall of Waiting. There were 5 drummers. One stood in each corner of the square hall, and the 5th, a young man, stood in the middle. He was a soloist and a very fine drummer. Naked to the waist, his brown skin, his dark brown trunk glistening with the red girdle, white shokas, the long skirt reaching the feet, and the white turban, arms covered with shining bracelet, he stepped up onto the golden Buddha, bearing a double drum, to sacrifice the music. There, the beautiful movements of body and arms, he drummed along a strange melody, artistically perfect. I watched him from behind, and he stood in front of the entrance to the old mandapam, which was covered with little oil lamps. The drum speaks the ancient language of the belly and the solar plexus. The belly does not pray, but engenders the meretricious mantram or meditative utterance. It is therefore not adoration of the non-existent Buddha, but one of the many acts of self-redemption performed by the awakened human being. Towards the beginning of spring I set out on my homeward voyage, with such a plethora of impressions that I did not have any desire to leave the ship to see Bombay. Instead, I buried myself in my Latin alchemical texts, but India did not pass me by without a trace. It left tracks which led from one infinity into another infinity. 5. Ravenna and Rome. Even on the occasion of my first visit to Ravenna in 1913, the tomb of Galla Placidia seemed to me significant and unusually fascinating. The second time, 20 years later, I had the same feeling. Once more, I fell into a strange mood in the tomb of Galla Placidia. Once more, I was deeply stirred. I was there with an acquaintance, and we went directly from the tomb into the baptistry of the Orthodox. Here what struck me first was the middle blue light that filled the room. Yet I did not wonder about this at all. I did not try to account for its source, and so the wonder of this light without any visible source did not trouble me. I was somewhat amazed because, in place of the windows I remember having seen on my first visit, there were now 4 great mosaic frescoes of incredible beauty, which, it seemed, I had entirely forgotten. I was vexed to find my memory so unreliable. The mosaic on the south side represented the baptism of the Jordan, the second picture on the north, the passage of the children of Israel through the Red Sea, the third on the east soon faded from my memory. It might have shown Naaman being cleansed of leprosy in the Jordan. There was a picture on this theme in the old Meridian Bible in my library, which was much like the mosaic. The fourth mosaic on the west side of the baptistry was the most impressive of all. We looked at this one last. It represented Christ holding out his hand to Peter, who was sinking beneath the waves. We stopped in front of the mosaic for at least 20 minutes and discussed the original ritual of baptism, especially the curious archaic conception of it as an initiation connected with the real peril of death. Such initiations are often connected with the peril of death and so serve to express the archetypal idea of death and rebirth. Baptism had originally been a real submersion, which at least suggested the danger of drowning. I retain the most distinct memory of the mosaic of Peter sinking, and to this day can see every detail before my eyes: the blue of the sea, the individual chips of the mosaic, the inscribed scrolls proceeding from the mouths of Peter and Christ, which I attempted to decipher. After we left the baptistry, I went promptly to Al Linari to buy photographs of a mosaic, but could not find any. Time was pressing. This was only a short visit, and so I postponed the purchase until later. I thought I might order the pictures from Zurich. When I was back home, I asked an acquaintance who was going to Ravenna to obtain the pictures from me. He could not locate them, for he discovered that the mosaic I had described did not exist. Meanwhile, I had already spoken at a seminar about the original conception of the baptism, and on this occasion had also mentioned the mosaics that I had seen in the baptistry of the Orthodox. That's called the Tantra Yoga Seminar, 1932. The memory of these pictures is still vivid to me. The lady who had been there with me long refused to believe that what she had seen with her own eyes had not existed. As we know, it is very difficult to determine whether and to what extent 2 persons simultaneously see the same thing. In this case, however, I was able to ascertain that at least the main features of which we both saw had been the same. This experience in Ravenna is among the most curious events in my life. It can scarcely be explained. A certain light may possibly be recast by an incident in the story of the Empress Gallia Placida, died 450. During a stormy crossing from Byzantine to Ravenna in the worst of weather, she made a vow that if she came through safely, she would build a church and have the perils of the sea represented in it. She kept this vow by building the Basilica of San Giovanni in Ravenna and having it adorned with mosaics. In the early Middle Ages, San Giovanni, together with its mosaics, was destroyed by fire, and in the Ambrosia of Milan is still to be found a sketch representing Gallia Placida in a boat. I had, from the first visit, been personally affected by the figure of Galla Placidia, and had often wondered how it must have been for this highly cultivated, fastidious woman to live at the side of a barbarian prince. Her tomb seemed to me to have a final legacy, through which I might reach her personally. Her fate and her whole being were vivid presences to me, with her intense nature, and she was a suitable embodiment for my anima. Footnote. Jung himself explained the vision as a momentary new creation by the unconscious arising out of his thoughts about archetypal initiation. The immediate cause of the concretization lay, in his opinion, in the projection of his anima upon Galla Placidia. End of footnote. The anima of a man has a strongly historical character. As a personification of the unconscious, she goes back into prehistory and embodies the contents of the past. She provides the individual with those elements which he ought to know about his prehistory. To the individual, the anima is all life that has been in the past and is still alive in him. In comparison to her, I have always felt myself to be a barbarian who really has no history, like a creature just sprung out of nothingness, with neither a past nor a future. In the course of my confrontation with the anima, I had actually had a brush with those perils which I saw represented in the mosaics. I had come close to drowning. The same thing happened to me as to Peter, who cried for help and was rescued by Jesus. What had been the fate of the Pharaoh's army could have been mine. Like Peter and like Naaman, I came away unscathed, and the integration of the unconscious contents made an essential contribution to the completion of my personality. What happens within oneself when one integrates previously unconscious contents with the consciousness is something which can scarcely be described in words. It can only be experienced. It is a subjective affair quite beyond discussion. We have a particular feeling about ourselves, about the way we are, and that is a fact which is neither possible nor meaningful to doubt. Similarly, we convey a particular feeling to others, and that too is a fact that cannot be doubted. As far as we know, there is no higher authority which could eliminate the probable discrepancies between all these impressions and opinions. Whether a change has taken place as the result of integration, and what the nature of that change is, remains a matter of subjective conviction. To be sure, it is not a fact which can be scientifically verified, and therefore finds no place in an official view of the world. Yet it nevertheless remains a fact that it is a practice uncommonly important and fraught with consequences. Realistic psychotherapists, at any rate, and psychologists interested in therapy can scarcely afford to overlook the facts of this sort. Since my experience in the baptistry in Ravenna, I know with certainty that something interior can be seen exterior, and that something exterior can appear to be interior. The actual walls of the baptistry, though they must have been seen by my physical eyes, were covered over by visions of altogether different sight, which was completely real as the unchanging baptismal font. Which was real at this moment? My case is by no means the only one of its kind, but when that sort of thing happens to oneself, one cannot help taking it more seriously than something heard or read about. In general, with anecdotes of that kind, one is quick to think of all sorts of explanations which dispose of the mystery. I have come to the conclusion that before we settle upon any theories in regard to the unconscious, we require many, many more experiences of it. I have traveled a great deal in my life, and I should very much like to go to Rome, but I felt I was not really up to the impression the city would have had made on me. Pompeii alone was more than enough. The impressions very nearly exceeded my powers of receptivity. I was able to visit Pompeii only after I had acquired, through my studies of 1910 to 1912, some insight into the psychology of classical antiquity. In 1912, I was on a ship sailing from Genoa to Naples. As the vessel neared the latitude of Rome, I stood on the railing. Out there lay Rome, the still smoking fiery hearth from which ancient cultures had spread, enclosed in the tangled network of the Christian and Occidental Middle Ages. There classical antiquity had lived in all its splendor and ruthlessness. I always wonder about people who go to Rome, as they might go, for example, to Paris or to London. Certainly Rome, as well as these other cities, can be enjoyed aesthetically. But if you are affected to the depths of your being at every step by the spirit of what broods there, if a remnant of a wall here and a column there gaze upon you with fierce, instantly recognized, then it becomes another matter entirely. Even in Pompeii, unforeseen vistas opened, unexpected things became conscious, and questions were posed which were beyond my powers to handle. In my old age, in 1949, I wished to repair this omission, but that was stricken with a faint while I was buying tickets. After that, the plans for a trip to Rome were, once and for all, laid aside. Reader's commentary. Um, this is a pretty spectacular chapter. It was really nice to hear his travels. I particularly appreciated his experience of uh, the Buddha, being a Buddha. That was really nicely done. And it was interesting, sort of his rant about Hinduism, which, I as a Westerner, I certainly have heard myself have that same kind of rant. Well, I really appreciated the peek into what it was like from his perspective. the travels that he had all over the world. If you've listened this far, thank you.